this genocide and also the structures of violence that reinforce white supremacy in healthcare. So today we're going to have a little bit of a smaller group. The session will be facilitated by myself, Dr. Asfiya Qadir, and of course our favorite MD PhD student, Morgan Shalmiers. Um, Okay, so we're going to get started as people trickle in. So, all the sessions before today have mostly focused on building individual power. So, from finding your voice, tapping into your courage, and maintaining your power during episodes of repression at work, and also to understanding the structures of violence we're positioned in as individual healthcare workers and students. So today's session is going to be a little bit different. Today's session is going to get us moving from thinking about building and maintaining our individual power to building and maintaining collective power. So hopefully this short overview will offer you some skills that'll help you begin organizing healthcare workers at your particular site of struggle. You know, we've been talking about this throughout the sessions, but it's our belief that healthcare workers really need to tap into being community organizers in order to really achieve health equity and justice. So this short guide is going to be a starting point for those of you looking to organize and mobilize your colleagues to affect social change in the healthcare setting. So in this first part, again, we're going to briefly review moving from individual to collective power. So the reason we focused on individual power so much is that it's really important to cultivate and that it's the necessary building block of a movement or mobilization, and it's the necessary building block of collective power. So we've talked about individual power extensively over the last few sessions, but individual power includes having courage, being able to resist repression when you face it, and also being able to connect your behaviors, your actions with your values. Now, collective power is the idea that in numbers, we can exert a much stronger impact. So to change society to match with shared community values. So think about examples like, phone calls logged with elected officials or signatures in the thousands on petitions like the Stop Cop City petition here in Atlanta, or being able to amplify voices on social media in the mass to overcome censorship. Collective power is also a reflection of organizing and mobilizing in community rather than individually. And we're much more effective in creating social change as a collective than we are as individual actors. People power is stronger than structural power, and that's what collectives teach us. But we know that medical institutions are organized in ways that are not necessarily transparent, which makes it difficult to mobilize. So there's like multiple committees and medical institutions and executive boards and structure and various structures of chains of command. And it's difficult to know who answers to who and what those chains of commands are. Even more convoluted, the power dynamics and relationship between various leaders in healthcare organizations are usually not transparent for those of us working as employees or students or staff. And this deliberate obfuscation makes it notoriously difficult to organize in the healthcare setting. So, of course, the question we're all asking as healthcare workers and students is how do we hold our medical institutions to account for enacting policies, enacting practices that violate medical ethics, best practices for our patients, and even render themselves potentially liable for genocide, incitement, and abetment, which we've seen healthcare organizations, hospitals, medical schools do. So we've talked a lot about our collective responsibility as healthcare workers, that we're positioned to fulfill this role as part of our clinical professional obligations. And while this has always been our role in this moment of genocide, fueled by our academic, medical, and political institutions, the urgency is higher than ever that we step up into collective action and collective power and mobilization. So it's rare and difficult for individual actors to change our structures and institutions, but collective courage and collective movements can push your structures and institutions to change, even if they don't want to. Structures and institutions like healthcare settings are made by individuals, and they can be outnumbered and outmobilized. So really the rest of today's session is going to offer a very, very, very brief overview on how to build a movement in your local setting. Um, this session is really meant to bridge you as a healthcare worker from becoming somebody who offers individual care work to collective care work, to become a collective mobilizer, to be able to offer care to your community by really changing the social conditions that degrade the health of our patients and our families and our community members. So I know this sounds really intuitive, but it's actually where a lot of people get hung up in movement building. The first step to building a movement, to building a collective, to creating collective power is just to gather people who have shared values and goals. So not only is this the first step to building a movement, but it also inherently counters the hegemonic culture in medicine and healthcare that tells us to isolate, that tells us not to talk about politics and not to be in community. And so even just the power of gathering is so inciting to white supremacist violence that the like we saw with the encampments that they are willing to send police and state troopers to break down mass gatherings of people who are just feeding themselves, who are offering aid to each other, who are just reading and educating together. That's the power of gathering with like-minded people. And a lot of individuals tend to feel like, especially in healthcare, that they don't know how to start building something in their setting, especially because you usually feel alone. And I felt like that particularly as a medical student. But I will tell you that if you're feeling irritated, if you're feeling gaslit, if you're feeling repressed by your institution around the genocide, so do others. They also feel silenced. They also feel unseen, just like you, and they also feel unsafe, just like you, in their healthcare environment, in their work setting. Um, and so if you feel alone, how might you find like-minded people? It can literally be as simple as creating a flyer that's like healthcare workers for justice, interested in gathering, fill out this Google form. And you can paste these flyers in the bathrooms, in your work lounges, or on social media. And in cases where you feel like putting the word Palestine won't be tolerated on a flyer, there's other ways to word it and gather. So an example I'll give you is a very beginning in the genocide, I was trying to organize graduate students, and I was cognizant of putting the word Palestine or Gaza on the flyer. So I made a really vague flyer, and it literally just said like graduate students, who care about justice. If you feel silenced by your department, if you care about social justice and feel like you can't talk about it in your work environment, fill out this Google form and meet like-minded people. And I literally just like walked around campus and I put this flyer up. And it brought together like over 20 students at a time where I was feeling really isolated. And everybody else who showed up was like, we didn't know there was other people who cared. And you'll find that that's true where you work too. Um, Something I will say for healthcare workers in this moment is to encourage folks to first gather outside of the healthcare setting. I think that is important for a few reasons. The healthcare setting itself is repressive. It is silencing. There's a hierarchy constantly present. You feel surveilled. You might feel uncomfortable. So I would start off with recruiting fellow healthcare workers and then encouraging them to gather off your site of work to encourage vulnerability, in order to sort of move that group into collective action. Another way for folks to like put together a first gathering is just to ask the one or two people you might know in your workplace who share your values to bring one or two friends to the gathering. So using your existing networks, to bring people together. And don't feel demoralized if your first like gathering is 5 people. 5 people is enough to start a movement. It really is enough. And it will naturally grow as you grow and as you continue to gather. So I have here a few questions that might help guide some of these first gatherings if you really don't know where to start. The most important thing of these gatherings is to get to know each other and not just in a work capacity, but in the human capacity. And this also helps you to identify what everyone brings to the table. So you might be surprised, for instance, that one of your colleagues actually organized their graduate student union back in the day. And so knowing the strengths of your community members will be useful as you move to action. And I'll pass this on to Dr. Calder.
Okay, yes, thank you so much. So, how do you go about thinking about your collective? Um, again, it doesn't matter how many people you're starting out with, right? This is where quality is the most important thing. And so, just from my own experiences locally in the Twin Cities, we spent a lot of time in our local healthcare worker chapter really thinking about identity, rooted in values. And so we had to figure out what was going to be the organizing principle, the unifying goals, to say, liberation can mean different things to different people. And if you don't have these conversations early on, and really, have them openly and welcoming of everybody's thoughts and perspectives and learning, what the risk of skipping this step is that you end up having fractures later on where there isn't an anchoring principle to hold everybody together. Like, why are we here to begin with, especially if things become more challenging or you have to kind of think through problem solving together. So ultimately, what's really helpful to think about is liberation work at its root is relationship building, right? The whole point is to build a world, build a community, build societies that are nourishing, that people are caregiving as a community, not taking advantage of one another, but rather sharing of resources where equity, justice, all of this is the grounding. So liberation work ultimately is in relationship building. And so you may have heard this in other spaces too, where like while you are working towards the world that you are hoping to see in a sort of abstract way, you have to live it, right? You have to live it in your relationships on the ground in the present. And that's how you build your community. And so it kind of reminds us of the idea. You can contrast this, for example, a community of caregiving in contrast to a capitalist system, right? Where it's not just an economic system, but it's a way of relating to one another. It's how we look at one another. It's how we value each other. It's what we value in each other. And so when we have communities of care, this is when we're actually building relationships with one another that are nourishing, where we see each other fully, where we look after one another. Not only are we coming together to organize around a particular action, but we know something of what's going on in each other's lives so that we can, ask after one another. We can share advice with one another. We can hold space for each other because we're all living our lives as we're doing the work because it's all integrated, right? These are not compartmentalized parts of us, it's all one. So I hope that makes sense. Just think about how we've done these sessions, right? We have interwoven these sessions even as we're all going through, the last, several months. And you can't really separate it. So looking after one another, caring for one another is the point here. The other point of having really this sentiment of caregiving, a community of caregiving as your group, is that it's necessary to sustain. In order to sustain over time, you have to have these bonds, you have to have these relationships with one another. And the stronger those relationships are, then the longer you're going to sustain, the more work you're going to be able to do together and move through hardships, move through conflicts, move through exhaustion, together. Another point to think about is, think a lot of groups and organizing spaces came up over the last year and a half. We know that there are organizations that have been advocating for Palestinian liberation for many, many years, right? Well established. And then there are the groups that just popped up in the last year or so, right? So for those, especially that are new, when you're forming a group, think about, are you a group that supports the liberation of Palestine? Are you a group that has sympathy for the cause? Or are you actually part of the core of the liberation movement. These are not the same things. To be actually identified as core anchored into the liberation movement itself, then that means you're part of something that has existed for generations, right? This is not something that's up for, you know, creating something new, right? Um, so you have to then study, learn, and a core part of this is going back and learning the thawabit. And so you can find this when you look online, you can find this. Healthcare Workers for Palestine is rooted in the thawabit. These are the core principles underlying the Palestinian liberation movement. And these are core principles that you can look at them and decide together with your group, do we adhere to this? Do we all want to use this space that we're organizing and say, yep, we adhere to this and we all agree on it? If there's any disagreement or hesitancy or thought of, well, maybe some, but not all of the points, then the best advice is to be honest, right? Be honest in the work that you're doing and be very clear that you are in support of, but you're not necessarily rooted in the core of the Palestinian liberation movement. I think this is really important. And maybe when we have the bigger session together and discussion, we can talk a little bit more. But I think what I'm trying to say here is be very honest about who you are as a group, knowing that it can evolve as well as it should. So have clarity on where you place yourselves in the bigger picture. The other thing that's, very helpful is that don't reinvent the wheel. If you are going to start a chapter, that has already like a national component chapter, or there are other chapters in other cities or states, go ahead and reach out and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. They may already have a blueprint that you can use. I know we benefited from, national healthcare workers for Palestine, as we were coming up as well. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can already root back to work that's already been done, especially if you're not starting something new. If you're starting a chapter of something that's already well established. The other thing that is very helpful is that you can look at, practically speaking, what are the resources? Like take an inventory. Just let's say you have 10 people, right? Take an inventory on who brings what skills, who brings what particular talents, experience, who is somebody who is good at public speaking, who is really good at writing, who's somebody who is passionate about art, who's somebody who has good connections within the community already. Everybody has different strengths, in how they can participate in the work. So welcome all of it. And I think what the beautiful thing is you're going to have your own unique identity of what kind of things you can do based on the skill set that you all have collectively, right? And so based on not only your skill set, but look at also practically speaking, physically, time, energy, health. These are all part of, resources, and they may fluctuate over time, but that's okay. You don't have to be a certain way all the time. I think this is a trap that we often get into. We have these expectations that are kind of idealized, and then it's really hard to hit that mark all the time, but it's also not realistic. So I think be mindful of, at any given time, what are the resources that you all have together collectively? What can you do? So like in our chapter, sometimes we've had a plan for a certain action or particular thing that we're going to do, and we've been able to pull it together and do it, and like that, as we planned. There's been times too where we had an idea for something, but ultimately we realized we didn't have the resources, right? And that's okay too. Look at what your resources are at any given time and then, start from there. So just to give a perspective, with healthcare workers for Palestine, there are so many different chapters. There's more than 30, let's say, across the US, but different chapters excel in different things, right? And I think that's a really beautiful thing, especially if you're able to connect with one another. You know, certain chapters are very good at, you know, doing like legal advocacy, or political advocacy. Some are very, excellent at bringing the community together and communicating and educating. Some are able to bring medical surgical supplies together. Some are able to do mutual aid. I mean, there's so much different chapters will excel at, and it depends on just what your resources are locally. But don't forget that no matter what you're doing as a small group, you're part of a bigger movement, a bigger effort, and all of it is helpful. And then the last thing I'll say is work locally, right? Remember, everything is connected. And so look at the issues that are facing your communities locally. As healthcare workers, we have that lens of what's going on that is contributing to illness, and morbidity within our communities that we serve, right? So you're going to be having the vantage point locally to know what are the big issues that need to be addressed, what are the gaps in care, what are the issues that matter to the people who are struggling. And as advocates, we can connect all of that, right? We have that perspective. And so work locally. That is the best way to not only be relevant, but be impactful, right? And that's a kind of a core principle. You don't want to be working in the abstract. You want to be focusing on how can you impact the local community where you're at right now. All of the issues that we're talking about related to Palestine, right, are issues that are local for all of us, that you can see the impact. So all of it is one. Looking, and then I think I will hand it off now to Morgan for power mapping.
Yeah. Um, so power mapping, I think, is a really important part of organizing. Taking a minute to kind of critically think through what your goals are, what strengths you have in terms of the folks who are involved that you're organizing with, and kind of figuring out where you can plug in locally to have maximum impact and effect. And so like one of the reasons that it's important to power map is because when you're organizing against like the US government-backed genocide in Gaza, it's like, what can we do as 5 people? What can we do as 10 people? Like, it feels very like hopeless, like you're too small to make an impact. So I think power mapping allows you to really connect the dots and like map those connections to figure out where the ties are locally and like how you can have a maximum tangible impact, and like map out your strategy and your actions and your events kind of accordingly. I think it allows you really to think about local structures of power and identify kind of the issues or like the ties that it makes the most sense for you as a group to work on, and then like structure your actions to focus on those. I think one of the, I don't want to say mistakes, but we see a lot of kind of general protests or efforts to raise awareness. And one of the dangers of that is like you see, especially now, like it's great that there's so many people opposed to the sort of violence the Trump administration is enacting, but you also see like there's the danger of controlled opposition, right? Like these large protests, these events where people go and they kind of get their anger out and they hold up a sign and they yell and they chant and they feel like they've done something. So I think it's important in our organizing to really be critical and strategic from like the very first moment when you start planning an action and forming as a group to think about like what are our goals in terms of impact? Like, do we just want to go and like yell at city council members? Do we want to just like have everyone show up on campus and like have this visibility be our goal, like have people wear a keffiyeh or put like a flag sticker on their laptop, right? Like these can be goals, but like to articulate them and make them concrete and figure out how do they tie into a larger strategy so that your actions feel meaningful. They don't just feel like, well, we did this protest, we did this vigil, and then it's kind of disconnected from a larger strategy that informs kind of your identity as a group and your goals as a group and what you are aiming for and how you see it as connected to larger struggles. This can also be really critically important in identifying other groups that you can build coalitions with. So, in terms of thinking about how your struggles like overlap and how this is a way to build power and strength. And I think one thing, you just go back to the last slide, sorry, I'm like going a little out of order, but when we think about like what are possible targets or possible goals, they're really wide, right? So there's a lot of efforts now to like introduce the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism at an institutional level, even at the federal government level, which defines any criticism of the government of Israel or the state of Israel as inherently anti-Semitic, right? And so if locally that's something that's happening, that's one area in which your group could organize. Like, how do we oppose efforts to institutionalize a ban effectively on the criticizing the state of Israel? Or you can think about like at the city level, like are there sister city partnerships that kind of uphold Zionism and erase Palestinians and like normalize the occupation? You have to think about like the local context. Or does your state government, does your city council, does your city government, do they invest in Israel bonds? Does your healthcare institution invest in Israel bonds? I mean, you can, depending on if it's a private or a public institution, there are varying levels of transparency, but you can really work, like there's a lot of resources, and you'll see on the last slide, I'll share and I'll put them in the chat as well, but links to like toolkits to help with power mapping. I really like Little Sis as a resource. It's a database that is kind of collectively maintained through open source. So research that other folks have already done is accessible to you, and you can link it into your power map. I would really, really recommend that. And also going through their guide called Map the Power. But yeah, in terms of like possible targets, you can also think about like investments directly in weapons companies. Like the American Friends Society has a really great database that looks at who specifically is making each of the different kinds of bombs that's used in Gaza right now, who makes the jets that drop those bombs. Like the PYM has the Maersk campaign, right? Thinking about like in your local community, which of these weapons manufacturers has ties to your hospitals, has ties to your educational institutions, and figuring out like what's the most strategic way for you to direct your efforts as you organize, and how do those efforts align, right? Like, I mean, I'm in San Diego when we think about the border and who profits off of surveillance at the border and the criminalization of migrants. It's Elbit Systems, right? An Israeli company, or like General Atomics, General Dynamics. Like, how do we think about not only our efforts and our targeted kind of goals to oppose the genocide in Gaza, but also how many of these same actors are very much involved in racialized violence against communities in the US. I think that's a really critical point because it allows us to build larger coalitions, so that we then have the power to really do something, right? And in order to have that efficacy, I think we need to have a lot of specificity in terms of the power mapping and being able to articulate our goals. Um, just in terms of like final examples for like possible targets or like goals, things to organize around. You can look at investments, you can look at research partnerships. In healthcare particularly, there's a lot of organizing now around TEVA, the Boycott TEVA campaign that was just launched in the US. There are similar campaigns in France, in South Africa, in Canada, I think in Britain as well now, that kind of use the BDS strategy, right? Like boycott, divestment, and sanctions as a way to kind of make the occupation of Palestine and the displacement and dispossession and the genocide of the Palestinian people, to make it economically like unfeasible, untenable to continue to support Israeli companies like Teva that profit and that work in the occupied part of like the beyond like the 67 line, right? Like you can make great arguments, and they're already made for us, in fact. Part of the reason that I think power mapping is really critical is because you don't want to invent the wheel on your own. Organizations like the ADL that try to promote the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, there's already a whole toolkit called Drop the ADL. They have a website. So like you can go to that website and you can use resources that have already been developed. There's resources by like the Campaign for Palestinian Rights on how to pressure your city council to divest from Israel bonds. A lot of this research has already been done. So in terms of like your own power mapping at the local level, when you articulate where those most strategic points for you to focus on are, you can also then look at what resources are already available that you can utilize so you don't have to do the extra work of reinventing the wheel, because a lot of these toolkits are really, really excellent. Like there's the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism that has done a lot of mapping of kind of Zionist financial ties in the US and who are the organizations promoting settlement in the West Bank, right? Like who are the organizations funding that through US official NGOs? Um, and yeah, let's see. I think those are all my examples. But yeah, just some final resources. I'll add these links in the chat. I really recommend the little SIS database. And then there's like kind of a big amalgamation of different tools you can use, like the ProPublica tax return database, different examples of ways people have visualized these ties, like the mapping genocide database, some stuff from supply studies. I put it all in this bit.ly, the Senate tools bit.ly, and I'll put it in the chat as well. So also use the Signal group as a resource. Like if you want to do power mapping and you have some questions about how to do like a Freedom of Information Act request or something like this, always reach out to community, even like across the US or internationally, because there's usually folks who have done similar sort of research before, and they're very, very generous with their time and like willing to help you with it. So yeah, and with that, I will pass it on to I don't know if it's Asfia or Umaima, but next slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Morgan. That is so helpful. If folks have never done power mapping, and if folks don't know where to start, like on what your targets should be, Morgan has given really an amazing overview of some sources where you could start thinking about how can I find out the ties my institution has with genocide, with police violence, etc. Thank you so much for that, Morgan. So some of this is going to be a little bit reiterative of what Morgan introduced. Um, so once you start having a regular collective of people meeting, and you've all started to identify the goals and values that unify you, at that point, you're ready to take action. So after power mapping, um, you can have many different forms of action based on what your goals are. So you can see on this diagram here that we have like loosely categorized different strategies. And by strategy, we mean like an action that serves a particular goal. So these strategies have been loosely categorized into low risk to higher risk. And by that, we mean the risk of repression by the state or your institution. So typically, events and actions whose goals aim to raise the visibility of a cause are low risk. Low risk actions that focus on visibility and education are important for raising political consciousness and for changing our local cultures, but typically they don't change violent or oppressive, harmful conditions. Some of the things that are in the visibility and education low risk category include like written materials like op-eds or pamphlets, educational events like film screenings or panels, um, things of that nature. But I do want to say like we're in unprecedented times, and that really no action for social change today, especially around ending the genocide in Palestine, can be considered low risk anymore. So, for example, in this chart, we put writing an op-ed on the low risk action, and yet it was the reason Rumesa's student visa was revoked and she was eventually detained by ICE for writing an op-ed in a student newspaper. And so I want to clarify here on this diagram that low risk actions don't necessarily mean no repression. We live in a world where repression can be used no matter what. Even if you're not taking an action, you can be repressed for simply aligning yourself with people who take actions. We just mean here that there's less likely to be repression in response to these actions. But again, we really are living in unprecedented times, and we're seeing the empire really crack down on any action and any association with the movement to build a liberatory world. So in the middle here, you can see our strategies for actions that seek to challenge impunity of individuals or structures that cause or promote harm. I would say this probably includes like the widest range of actions. Like some examples we have here are name and shame strategies. We're seeing that being used really commonly by students on university campuses to like identify and expose war criminals and IDF soldiers, things like that. Um, Other things that go in the challenging impunity, medium risk category include like non-disruptive protests or pushing for your local government to pass ceasefire resolutions, etc. And these events typically have a medium risk of repression to them. And of course, the last category of action types we have here are strategies that have been used to change the material conditions under structural violence, oppression, and genocide. These types of actions do usually carry the highest risk for state violence because they do create material change. And they're also usually the most effective in challenging white supremacy. So one of the examples that come to mind here is like Palestine Action, which organizes small groups of people to destroy and damage weapons manufacturing companies. And if you follow them, you'll see that they have often cost these companies like millions of dollars to repair the damages. Sometimes they're so effective that they actually stop production for a few days in these companies. And so these protests can also be high risk actions if they're used to disrupt. So we've seen like some pretty big marches, like disrupt highways, for example, for several minutes or even hours. We've seen people mobilize to block entrances to companies, for example, that invest in apartheid Israel, that prevent workers coming into weapons manufacturing companies, etc. And I do want to clarify that this is not like an effectiveness scale. We need all levels of all of these actions. You just need to articulate what your goal is. And so when you're organizing and deciding like what action you want to take, the first thing you really need to consider, like I said earlier, is what's the goal of your action? Because you want to choose a strategy that will effectively reach that goal. So, for example, if your goal is to educate healthcare workers about the genocide in Palestine, then blocking the entrance of a weapons manufacturing company is like not the best strategy, right? You might choose like a panel, you might choose a film screening, you might choose something else. So when you have a goal, so that's the first thing you need to articulate really before you choose the action. My goal is to educate my healthcare worker colleagues about the destruction of the healthcare system in Gaza. Then you can choose the potential strategies that will help you achieve that particular goal. So you see this like little diagram can be helpful for you to think about as you're planning actions as a collective. What's the goal? Does my strategy match the goal? Does the risk level make sense for the strategy? So here I have two more examples, one whose strategy and goals align and one who doesn't. So if we're looking at the green bubble, the green diagram, it's illustrating that if your goal is to materially slow down the genocide in Gaza, then it is an appropriate strategy to do something like shut down a weapons manufacturing company for one day, for example, or even half a workday. And although this is a high risk event, it is also more effective in achieving the like material change we need to end the genocide, which is why weapons manufacturing companies have been a main target for a lot of organizers in the last 18 months. On the other hand, what we often see is that people's goals and strategies don't align. And the harm that comes with that is that it can actually lead to like collective fatigue and despair. So, for example, like we'll often see people say things like their goal is to end the genocide in Gaza, but their only strategy that they're taking are organizing like panel discussions or non-disruptive protests or something like that, or film screenings. And although all of those actions are necessary in the sphere of social change because they build political consciousness, which is part of the building block to collective change, they don't actually do anything materially to end the genocide. And so it's important as organizers to be honest about what your goal is. So if your goal is to increase education, then panel discussions make sense, for example. Because we don't want to get to a point where organizers are getting demoralized because they're asking themselves, and I've definitely seen this in my local context, how is the genocide still going on in Gaza when we've been protesting every single week, Um, but your protests have not been disruptive, for example. They haven't like really done anything to change the conditions even locally around Palestine. So again, this is not to say that there's one type of organizing that's more important than the other, but it's more about making sure that you're being open and transparent about your goal and aligning that strategy with that goal so that you don't end up being like, I've organized, 15 protests. How is the genocide still going on? Because it can lead to fatigue and demoralization. Okay, so this part we're still kind of continuing with the building blocks of like building a movement. And so we've talked about resisting repression on an individual level pretty extensively, but now we're going to talk about it a little bit about resisting repression on a collective level. So I'm going to pass it on to Morgan again here.
Yeah, so this part will be a little bit brief. I know we've already gone over because we wanted to leave a lot of time for discussion in this last session, but just very briefly, like when we think about the strategies that are used to divide social movements and like that have been used historically, like since Vietnam to divide social movements, there are all these discourses about like outside agitators or like the peaceful protesters versus like the disruptors or like the radicals. And so how do we think about these discourses critically and ensure that they're not used as people are trying to use them now to divide organizing nationally on Palestine? I mean, we saw this a lot in the discourses around the encampments, and I think specifically in healthcare, because healthcare workers socially, we have access, like we're granted a particular kind of social prestige that when you do a protest in your white coats, it kind of means something different, like you have a privilege that you're granted that's like a larger part and very connected to structures of white supremacy in this country. So when we think about what does it mean to be organizing as healthcare workers, we can harness that privilege strategically, but there's also very much a danger of this division between like good and bad activists, right? Like, are you someone who is, you know, educating others about the healthcare implications of the genocide in Gaza, which is a great thing to do, or are you someone who like blocked a bridge and got arrested? And like you'll see these discourses that try to like pit different tactics and different strategies and different groups of folks against each other. Or that like the media will praise healthcare workers and like in doing so create a sort of discourse or a conversation in which like this is the right kind of activism. Like these are like the educated healthcare workers who are out there like doing the like organizing against the genocide in the right way. And like I think it's very important that we constantly remain vigilant of this tendency in the movement in every social movement, and a tendency that's also reinforced by like state strategies to divide movements like the Palestine Solidarity Movement that are opposed to the government support for Israel, right? Like these are classic like divide and conquer strategies that we've seen since the anti-war movement that took place in this country in Vietnam. So I think you have to be very, very conscious because these discourses get kind of smuggled in, and if you don't learn to see them and notice them, you won't realize that they're there. And I think it's really important. I mean, one of the ways we saw this showing up at the encampments was this idea that there are students and then there are outside agitators. And there's this, it was a move to delegitimize the protests. Like these aren't really students, these are outsiders, or like these aren't really fill in the blank healthcare workers. Like these are, five doctors and then all their friends, right? Like you want to be aware of how these often false discourses get harnessed and kind of weaponized in ways that work to divide, and ultimately like sap strength out of the social movement. So I think when we're organizing, especially now when like things like Umaima has said, feel like riskier and are riskier than ever, not everyone has the same sort of, not everyone has the privilege to take the same sort of risks, which is fine. Like there's no, it's not about like pressuring people to do more, quote unquote, riskier actions or more like direct actions, but we want to be very conscious of the ways in which there's like this type of discourse that's created that essentially elevates like the good activist as someone who like doesn't create problems, who like hosts a panel discussion on how like internally in our own movements and organizing, people who want to be able to like hang on to their own image of themselves, right? As a particular kind of like respectable healthcare worker who does things the right way and doesn't disrupt and doesn't, yell in the middle of a faculty thing about the genocide and institutional complicity and call for divestment, right? How do we constantly encounter this kind of burden or like impulse or like impetus to enact a particular kind of responsibility politics or like a respectability, like it's hard to describe, but I think once you start looking for it, you'll see what I'm saying. How do we notice it, first of all, and its impact, and then sort of guard against it within our own internal organizing spaces? Like sometimes it makes sense, especially in front of the media, to like harness the privilege that healthcare workers are granted, and to like use that to elevate your voice. but how do you ensure that you're not using it in a way that then kind of by implication creates like a different group of like the bad activists or the people, because we see this constantly, this sort of outside agitator move, or this move to talk about like the right way to protest or the wrong way to protest. And so I think it's really important to just be very conscious of that and just to start looking for it even in like mainstream media coverage of the Palestine movement now. How do we see like groups of bad activists versus groups of good activists being created in media discourses? Because it's very subtle. Like they don't tell you they're doing it, but like I would encourage everybody to really like, even if you don't normally read mainstream US media, I wouldn't encourage it as a news source, but like look at how actions are presented and how organizers are talked about, and start kind of paying critically attention to the sorts of groups and divisions that are created by these mainstream discourses that are essentially based on a sort of respectability politics.
Thank you for that framing, Morgan. That's really helpful, and I encourage people to do exactly what Morgan talked about, which is one, to review those sources that were offered if you really don't know where to start, and then just start paying attention. It's very akin to like the good versus bad Muslim narrative, if folks have ever read or tapped into that, and the way that the state weaponizes the good versus bad person. And I know we promoted this book like 100 times already, but like Muhammad al-Kurd's Perfect Victims also hits at this point. So buy a copy if you haven't, and read it. It's really useful. So moving on to our steps of building a movement. Um, I mentioned earlier that even in the like today's times, even low risk actions like writing an op-ed, which many of us have done, or attending a non-disruptive Palestine protest can get you deported. Being married to a Palestinian can get your visa revoked. We've seen also in the last 18 months, Palestinian students be shot for wearing kufiyas in public, right? So like Morgan was setting us up to get to, there's no amount of good organizing or being professional enough in our healthcare settings to ensure that we'll never experience repression, right? If our actions are effective, if we're increasing visibility of the genocide, if we're organizing for social change, repression is going to come for you no matter how good or professional or within the bounds you are. So knowing that, we must always be prepared for repression. I would really encourage all people, even for yourselves personally, but especially as collective organizers, to create a type of document for your collective, for your mobilization, excuse me, that outlines the potential risks your members are at, and then your plans to counter the repression. So for example, what's your plan if one of your members get doxxed, right? You should be thinking about that. Even if you're like, well, I'm not going to do anything that's going to get me doxxed. Like we are in a situation where like existing near a Palestinian can get you doxxed. Like it's really, you need to be prepared for anything at this point. Um, so for example, you could have a plan where you've already outlined how to change your email and phone number if that happens, if your personal information gets leaked. You can have people volunteer for potential like plans for housing if someone's address gets leaked to the public. We've seen these types of things happen for someone simply posting a selfie of themselves in a kufiya, right? Um, Another thing that we really recommend is for folks to always be in connection with some type of legal representative. So I'm not saying like have a lawyer that you need like to be represented individually by a lawyer, but knowing your legal contacts in your city, right? Like, do you have a care locally? Do you have a National Lawyers Guild chapter locally? Just know where those contacts exist and how to get a hold of them. Um, Again, even if you're not planning high risk actions, just for your own safety and security, find out what jail support networks exist in your local setting. And if they don't exist, potentially think about building one. There's a lot of resources on the internet you can go to help you start, so we won't belabor it. And another thing on your sort of preparing for repression toolkit should be your media contacts. In case, for example, you or your colleague gets suspended or fired, from your position in healthcare for speaking out against the genocide. We've talked a lot about responding to repression by growing and not shrinking. And one of the ways that people do that is to use media to expose the ways that violence and harm is manifesting in healthcare settings. Um, and the last thing I'll say about this is that preparing for repression actually increases your safety. So even if you don't expect any repression, because it makes you feel safer and it makes your members feel safer and more secure as you continue moving forward. And it offers like at least somewhat of a safety plan for new members who are more likely to join you and take action alongside you if they know you guys are already thinking about how to protect each other when the repression might come, right? We can't predict it. We don't know who's going to be targeted, but we can at least have a plan. And we've seen their playbook well enough to know that these are the potential things that are happen. We know someone's going to get doxxed at some point, right? Um, we know that we might have some legal risk. We know that social media might be used against us, whatever. The playbook has been clear, and a lot of people have already outlined it. And so there really is no excuse at this point for us not to be ready, at least thinking about what we might do, how we might respond, if one of us or a collective of us gets harmed in the process of our organizing. So we're going to end this session with a few strategies to think about how you sustain the movement. So starting a gathering of people, like 5 people who meet regularly is one thing, or who meet a few times is one thing, but how do you continue meeting? How do you sustain meeting in an exhausting life world where we're all being worked to death? People are struggling to survive. This is the real lived reality of us right now, of our communities. And it is difficult to continue mobilizing through it. So hopefully we can offer some strategies that are useful for you guys to think about in that context.
Okay, so step 6, grow your membership. So some of this I think is helpful to think about when you're like, how do we show up in community? How do we start building relationships? And like, what does that practically literally look like? One of the things that can be very helpful, again, always come back to connection. Always come back to community is about connection. And the more connections you have, the more sustainability you'll have, the more opportunity for resource sharing and perspective and guidance and support you're going to have. So these are just a few steps to get us thinking. So connect with other groups that are also doing liberatory work. And as long as you have like core principles in common and there's no big red flags, that would be, reasons to not connect and support one another, then you should be able to start building relationships with those groups that have already been well established. And remember that they're also looking for opportunities to connect and work with you as well. And they don't know that you're there. So one of the things you need to try to do is connect to other organizations and other groups. Try to make yourself visible. So one of the things that we did, especially when we were beginning and new, is we had banners, we had our posters, we had whatever would make us visible. We had our scrubs, our coats, all of this. And when we saw an event that was happening, we showed up. We tried to connect to the organizers to let them know that, healthcare workers will be present and, we're going to show up and support. And don't underestimate how much the community welcomes healthcare workers. And so it's actually an advantage for us that we are welcomed into spaces, even if we don't have big numbers, even if we don't have big resources yet. Your presence is welcome. And that's a really important thing to remember. We don't often value ourselves in the right ways. But this is a core thing that when we show up in community spaces, it is appreciated. Often we may be asked to speak, and so be prepared for that. And also, this is how you build relationships. And think about it almost like building relationships in community outside of organizing work. You invite people to your home, right? You have a meal together. You go to people's events. If someone invites you to their home, you go and you accept the invitation. It's the same idea. So pay attention to the events that are happening in the community. Show up. Make sure you meet people there. Make sure you introduce yourselves, and then invite them to events that you might put together. So especially early on, you might not be doing strategic moves like direct actions and things like that, the higher risk type of activities. You may be doing some of the things that are easier for you to organize and just to invite community in and build allyship, right? And so those are just some basic ideas of how to get started. In terms of building your connectedness within your group, again, remember, so much of the repression for healthcare workers is about separating us from one another. So just like Umaima was saying, it's a good strategy to start building community outside of the hospital, meet up for coffee or whatever outside of the institutional space. Start building those relationships, and then try to connect, whether it's remotely or in person. Try to connect once a week. Try to find ways to stay connected to one another during that week, right, in the interim between the formal meetings, but do try to have the pacing of once a week. That will help you build a sense of community, of predictability, of consistency, and think about the community where you get to meet once a week, no matter what, in the middle of the genocide that we're all experiencing, right? In the way that we are all taking it all in. 1 week is like a year. And so it's also for your own sustaining that you want to make sure you're meeting once a week. And then build the relationships. I think it's really important that not only do you relate to one another as a group, but try to relate to one another individually. Find opportunities to connect, build relationships out of the space of the bigger group, and then come back into the group. You're going to have a lot more strength in those bonds if you do it that way. Those are some like introductory guides. And then, is this you, Umaima?
Yeah.
Or is this me? Okay. All right.
Okay, so we're gonna wrap up soon here. I know this is a little bit of a longer didactic session than we typically do, but we hope that this really is useful, especially for beginner organizers and healthcare workers who haven't really tapped into mobilizing a network themselves. So the last sort of step we're gonna share today is to encourage people to practice care in their mobilization. We know organizing is difficult. And in order to sustain our movements, we need to move forward with care and patience and determination. I think an aspect of organizing that gets lost is that we have to learn to behave in the way we want our liberatory world to behave. Meaning, like, we need to enact the same tenets of justice and liberation and care and mercy in our own behaviors and in our own relationships. Because if we begin to mimic the behaviors of state violence in our own organizational relationships, like disposing of members we disagree with, like reacting with punitive measures in the face of conflict, or spouting the same harmful rhetoric that the state and institution uses against us, very much like Morgan was saying, coming to your colleagues and telling them if you were more professional, you wouldn't get doxxed, which is something that a lot of people have told me, for example. If we replicate the type of harm and rhetoric coming from our state institutions, we will never build effective movements for social change. And social change, collective movement building starts at individual power, which is why individual power, working on your individual self, cultivating that liberatory spirit in your behavior and in your reactions is the necessary building block to building an effective collective movement. And so what does it mean to practice care in your movement building? There's so much resources on the internet about this, and I really encourage you all to tap into that care wave movement. It's gotten a lot of attention in the last few years. There are people more brilliant than me who have articulated what it looks like to behave in that liberatory way in our individual relationships. So I really encourage you to go out and find those authors and books and resources. Um, but at the very basic level, are you assessing the needs of your community and collective, right? So for example, are you having meetings at times where people are busy? Are you having meetings that aren't providing childcare when the majority of your collective has young children, and they need childcare to be able to be present? Um, are do you know if everyone in your network has access to proper food and housing and transportation? Do you have a mutual aid fund set up in case a colleague of yours loses their job, for example, for advocating to end the genocide? Are you treating yourselves the same way the institution treats you, or are you working to build relationships that are generative and accommodating, and like a microcosm of the liberatory world and potential that we're trying to build? Um, the last thing I'll mention too about gathering and practicing care and building, collective power is to rotate the roles in your collective. It doesn't really fit anywhere here, but I threw it in here at the end because this is such an important aspect to organizing. And this is important because you don't want your leadership to get monopolized, and also everyone in your collective gets a chance to practice every role. So everyone gets a chance to practice leading, note taking, facilitating, and planning. um, we'll often see like collectives get led by like the same voices, which can sometimes lead to a replication of some of the power dynamics we don't want to see. And what this also sets you up to do for success and for sustaining your movement is say, like, when I get sick, right, there's someone because we have all rotated the roles. I can rely on everyone else in my collective to do the roles that I've been in charge of, to be able to facilitate, to be able to take the lead. And you've even seen that probably replicated in Cultivating Courage. You've noticed that not every facilitator is on every call. Life happens. We're getting suspended and fired and whatever. Like people have kids, and so we intentionally work to make sure that people are capable of holding every role, that they feel confident, that they've practiced these roles, so that we are able to sustain a project and a movement because people are people and life be life in, for all of us. Um, and it also builds collective power, builds collective confidence, and gives people the appropriate skills they need to continue to participate, to sustain the movement, and to keep going. So I'm going to let Dr. Qadir sort of trail us off before we go into our small group discussion link. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we are going to actually close out the didactic portion um, after this slide, and then we'll give some instructions for like how we're going to move into the discussion group for today. And as always, that discussion part, that processing part, will not be part of the recorded webinar part, right? So, once again, this was a very, short overview of how to start mobilizing collectively inside of your healthcare setting. We gave some strategies for how to do that. We encourage everybody here to do more research, keep learning, and remember the best way to learn to organize is to just start doing it, right? Don't get into the analysis paralysis. Just start stepping in there, right? And learn from what works, learn from what doesn't work, be honest about that. It's all about evolving and keeping moving forward. I'm so often reminded that it's called movement for a reason. So just start moving, right? Don't let the fear of failure make you, get stuck in paralysis. Organizing is about messing up, getting it wrong, figuring it out, making the correction, getting back up again, and, fighting for your community. I think there's a moral development in that, right? There's a resiliency inherent in that ability to get up and keep going. And this is how you're going to really learn the work very well. It's like riding a bike. You got to fall off a couple of times, then you'll figure it out. And so one of the things you want to keep reminding yourself that it's about continuing to try to mobilize, to try to affect change, right? And to try to change the conditions that are harming us, that are killing us, that are specifically limiting our capacity to live full lives, right? We want to protect our communities. We want to protect our patients, right? The work that we're doing is very far reaching. And so every part of what we do helps. Want to kind of take this moment also, this is our last session of the inaugural cohort. And so thank you so much for taking this journey with us. We hope it's been as generative for you as it has been for us. We were talking before today's session of how much we have learned and grown and how generative this putting this together has been. And we were kind of reminiscing about the conversations that we've had in the small groups as well, right? How moving those can be in learning and what each one is kind of going through. We hope to really expand the project itself and this curriculum in particular, and this growing network of healthcare workers, all of us together. So we would like to stay in touch with everybody here and to continue to build this community. This is part of the movement work, right? So thank you for being such an important part of this. What we'll do now is we'll shift to our next Zoom link that you probably already have. There are a couple of questions we'll do for reflection, but before we get to that, there is a post survey. So if you remember, you did the pre-survey before the first session. There's a post survey that we'd like you to fill out. We'll take about 5 minutes now. So it's in your email. So if everybody can you bring up your email, fill out that post survey, take about 5 minutes to do that, and then go ahead and hop on to the second Zoom link, the one for the discussion. And then I think we'll open it up there and we'll keep everybody together. We're not going to break into small groups. We're just going to be all of us together. And we'll run through a couple of reflection questions to close out today. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Calder. Okay, we'll see you guys on the next Zoom link. Please check your emails and it'll take you literally 2 minutes to go through that survey. It's not a long survey. It doesn't require, any long form answers. And it would be really useful for us. So once you've done that, please hop on to the next link and we'll, have a large group discussion. Okay, see you guys there.
All right.